In this video, we're going to walk through the anatomy of a Visual Studio ASP.NET MVC project. This is to get you familiar with the folders and files within a default ASP.NET MVC application so that you're familiar with where to go and how to navigate within the project to essentially accomplish the task that you're trying to do. So we'll start out, and most of this honestly should look fairly familiar to you if you've done C# development before. You have a solutions file first, and that solution is the container for multiple ASP.NET, or I'm sorry, multiple .NET projects. And then within here we have one project, which is our ASP.NET MVC project. Under there we have properties and references. Properties is where our assembly info lives, and that's basically a document that is providing metadata around our assembly. And when our projects get compiled into EXEs and DLLs, this is where that information is pulled from for assembly titles and names, COM compatibility, and then even version numbers located here at the bottom. Under references, we have a list of all of the other DLLs or assemblies that we are referencing in this project. Some of these should look familiar to you. Some of them are probably new to you, but they're fairly well documented and outlined, so you should be able to, just by glance, get a general understanding of what each one of those projects or assemblies does within the context of your project. After that, we have the app_data folder. This is where we would house our local DB database, which we'll talk about in later weeks. We can also store things like XML documents or any sort of data files that we would want to store that we don't want to make publicly available to users who are navigating to our website. The .NET framework and the ASP.NET engine actually hide and protect this folder from any sort of browser-based access by a client. So that's kind of the safe zone or sandbox area where we can store and write data without worrying about it being accessed by someone on the internet through their client browser. AppStart is a configuration specific folder, and under AppStart we typically see things like our route config, our filters config, any bundling that we do. These are all concepts that we'll cover later, but all of those configs kind of live underneath AppStart. This folder is really more of a convention name at this point in time. We'll see how the files, the classes underneath AppStart, are then referenced and coupled in and used within our ASP.NET application. The next folder is controllers. This is where our controllers will live. If you think back to last week's lecture, we talked about the idea of a model, view, and controller, and that controller is kind of the entry point to your web app. It takes in the request and then it works with the models and the views in order to actually generate the web page. So your controllers actually will all live in the controllers folder. And again, that's kind of the convention. Models, that's where you would put your data classes or your models for your application. And views is where your views would live. So underneath views right now, we have nothing but a web config, and we'll touch on what the web config does in more detail in the next lecture. But for now, that is just the location where our views or our HTML templates will live for our controllers. The next document is our global ASAX, and inside of this, you'll notice here that we have a couple lines of code that are pre-generated for us. We have area registrations, and we'll talk about areas in later week lectures. And then there's that route config that I had referenced earlier in the app start. This is where that route config actually gets called and does what's called route registrations. Packages.config has to do with utilizing NuGet packages. ASP.NET MVC, actually the entire MVC legacy for ASP.NET has always utilized NuGet packages for content delivery, and we'll talk about NuGet in a later lecture. And then the web config is the place where all of your server and application configuration goes. Basically, this is akin to the app.config that you may have utilized in your C# Windows applications. In this case, it's now called web.config. And there's references to assembly runtime bindings. We have our app settings. There are system.web specific settings. We can put our connection strings in here for our database connections. Everything would reside inside of this web config. So that is the basic anatomy of an ASP.NET MVC project. I start with an empty project because you get to see kind of the raw bones of the project. When you choose one of the higher level or more complex projects such as basic or internet project, it comes along with a lot of extra stuff, which is great and it helps you fast track new applications. But to get familiar with kind of the core basics of an application, of what the ASP.NET runtime needs as a minimum, these empty projects are a great starting point.